we have recorded today are ones that are admirable, but we've got a long way to go, so thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher, for that gracious acknowledgement, all and sundry there. So it's been moved, it's been seconded. All those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Okay, carried. We now go to item 16, the public transport zero emission update. Welcome back, Stacey and Mark. And we're going to receive an update on the ambition of AT for its resilient and low emissions transport system.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillors, Mr Mayor. The purpose of this presentation is to provide an update on our drive towards decarbonising the PT system. We've made significant progress, we believe, to date, and it's been touched on already around what we call mission electric and converting the public transport system to low or zero emission vehicles. That includes electrification of the rail network, key bus routes and depots that have been electrified, and we've mentioned already 133 zero emission buses on our network now, which is the second highest in Australasia. And we are currently building 4 new low or zero emission ferries as well, with 3 more to come. Stacey will go through the detail of those deliverables. I'll cover the first 4 slides or so, which really touches on the strategy and the intent. And I'll be pretty quick on this because you all know this, I think. So, of course, reduction in emissions is a critical part of both central and council's strategic intent and direction. The government policy direction seeks a low carbon transport system. And what does that mean for us in our bus network in particular? Zero emission bus fleet by 2035. And of course the council is also part of and is committed to C40 declaration, and that included no new diesel buses could be procured from 2025, and at the time AT committed to bringing that forward to 2021. Part of that also is a major part of the city and will be zero emission by 2030. Again, you'll know this in terms of the Auckland Climate Plan, we're seeking to halve emissions by 2030. Road transport is the most significant contributor to that at around 40% of all emissions. The graph there attempts to show that of the kilometres travelled by vehicles, carbon dioxide emissions in particular are greatest by ferry, followed by private vehicles. The carbon dioxide emissions, when you convert that into passenger kilometres, and it's fairly obvious, I think, but show that that's highest for private vehicles because, of course, our public transport vehicles are carrying way more than the average 1.25 passengers per private vehicle. This means that our strategy is, again, obviously focused on encouraging people into public transport and decarbonisation of public transport. The graph here breaks down our public transport fleet into total emissions by mode. So the blue part of the graph at the top is around our train fleet. It went down significantly in terms of emissions around 2015 when we completed electrification through a new passenger train fleet across the majority of the network other than Papakura to Pukekohe. And that part of the network will be completed next year. The grey for bus, the emissions from the bus network have increased proportionally across public transport, and that's because, of course, around 15, 16, 17, we significantly increased the bus public transport system. Orange is for ferry, and as you'll see, and we've had plenty of conversations already, but due to the ageing diesel fleet, the share for ferry emissions is by far disproportionately higher than for other modes because of the age of the fleet and the nature of the fleet as well. So I'll pass over to Stacey to talk in more detail around what we have achieved and what we are doing by mode. But in summary, train is effectively zero emission now. We've recently adopted version 3 of our low emission bus roadmap, which targets a 2035 full zero emission bus fleet, which is aligned to government targets. And at the moment, by 2034, we're targeting, with funding, we're targeting for half of the ferry fleet to be low or zero emission, with the full fleet targeted by 2040.
Fabulous, thank you. I'll try not to be too repetitive on those key points there. As Mark pointed out, our trains are fully electric after taking off the Papakura to Pukekohe DMU fleet last year, and obviously that upgrade's due to be complete with it being electrified next year, which will be fabulous in terms of that connectivity for our customers. Currently we have a fleet of 72 three-car electric trains, and we do have another 23 trains delivery between April 24 and May 25 to support CRL. The next stage of that, of course, is in their draft rail program business case with what we call tranche 4, and that will enable the future proofing when we get to that point in terms of 9-car train operations. In terms of our low emission bus roadmap, we've not long released version 3 of that. Currently we have 1,350 buses in our fleet. That will grow as our network grows as well, and they will, obviously every bus we procure from here is electric. Currently, as we said, we've got those 133 zero emissions buses currently on the network. And we also have the first and only hydrogen fuel cell bus in New Zealand. There are some in Australia. I'm pretty sure we're the first, though, actually, in Australasia to have that hydrogen bus. But I know there are some in Adelaide now. Currently, the full transition to zero emissions fleet is by 2035. Now, that's really important. That is subject to funding and the ongoing conversation with that to make sure that that's actually sustainable to reach that target. Cost estimated is 620 million compared to the do-nothing approach. So that's over the longer term until 2040. So that's the premium in that 20-year period that we need to pay to reach that target. There is what I call some cost advantage built into that model, so in terms of obviously batteries getting cheaper, etc. Now that there's way more production in terms of that, the unit cost coming down. A little bit more in terms of our low emission bus roadmap. So we're really lucky that we do have some of those key routes that are operated fully by zero emission vehicles. Those City Link, Airport Link, Waiheke Link, Tamaki Link, and then Eastern Bay's route 774, 775 and 762. We've just added the 24 route, so that's in terms of that New Lynn electrification. So the Sandringham Road's just gone fully electric as well. So at Panmure Depot, well, it's not our Panmure Depot, NZ Buses Panmure Depot is fully electric. New Lynn is actually half electric. It's not actually fully electric, but it has been enabled in order to be able to run electric buses now. We do have the Horsey Street, Te Rākau Drive, Mangere, Takanini and Albany depots do have charging infrastructure. It is one of our challenges when it comes to deploying EV fleets, is in terms of that enabling technology. It's huge. It's not just putting the enabling technology in, it's making sure that the system around it is built in order for the capability to actually meet that demand on the network. So it needs to be a holistic program in order to be able to make that work for us. We only own that one depot, we own the Te Rākau Drive depot, and we are currently going through an assessment in terms of that strategic approach to future-proof allocations, because of course that's critically important. It's critically important because that in terms of maximising what we call out-of-service running, or minimising is probably the better way to put it, minimising that happening and making our routes more efficient, making sure that we have those locations when we're in a tendering environment. We do risk losing them if we don't have that in our forward plan. So that's definitely in our plan, and of course when you're thinking about enabling technology, moving that about is not cheap. Yeah, so that is definitely something that we're looking very strongly at. Bus contracts expire from 2025 in the first round of PTOM, so the new contracts do require that 100% fully zero emission and to be in place no later than 2035. I know the question will come up with everybody is, does that mean stranded assets? No, that's why it's 2035, because we don't want to make something else non-sustainable by prioritising that. All new fleet do have to be electric, but in terms of that transition, we do want to make sure that we maximise usable life of existing fleet where we can, rather than having stranded assets. There is what we call secondary markets to be able to support in terms of school buses across the country where operators can redeploy, and they've been doing that when we have put in these fully electric ones. But making sure we're doing all that in a sustainable way is really important for the overall picture. In terms of the Future Ferry program, we of course, as we talked about earlier, our current fleet, which is out there, is what I call a hot potch of all different types of vessel types, etc. So we do obviously have a considerable need to do standardisation, across the fleet, both from an infrastructure perspective, but also to enable some of these situations that we see ourselves in with skippers only being able to drive certain fleet types, minimising that. So currently we've got 4 times refurbishment of 80 owned diesel ferries to improve reliability, extend life and lower emissions. And in next year, we'll be in receipt of 2 times 200 passenger fully electric ferries, and they're currently in build, and I know some of you have seen those being built. That's using the eco-funding provision in terms of that. In 25 and 26, we have 2 300 passenger hybrid electric vehicles, ferries, that will be deployed. So they're looking for delivery in 25 and 26, and they will be going on Devonport and Half Moon Bay. In 2026, we will be looking at 3 times 200 passenger electric or hybrid electric ferries, and they'll be going to Hobsonville and Half Moon Bay, and they'll be tendered later this year. From there, and subject obviously to the funding provisions, we'll be going to open market tenders and sort of looking at various options with that. Still very much subject to funding. And we'll leave it there, and we're happy to take questions, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacey. Just a very quick one from me. Excellent progress with the bus fleet. Could you tell how much does an electric bus cost, by the way?
A lot less than a ferry. It's, in terms of that, they do range, I guess, between 700k and upwards. I can't remember what the last one's in terms of cost. So the way we do them, of course, we currently have a unit out where it's actually closed and it's in evaluation stage. It's the first time we've competitively tendered an EV unit as a new thing. So that will give us a really sort of good benchmark to that. Right now, everything's been negotiated to date. The cost is coming down. As I said, in terms of our low emissions bus roadmap, that is accounted for in terms of that streamlining of cost.
Yeah. Thank you. Councillor Simpson?
Yeah, thank you. I've already congratulated you on your bus fleet and whatever, so thank you. But look, I just want to understand, just because I want to understand for my own benefit, the technical point about emissions per kilometre. Is the measure just about emissions and how far each of the vehicles travel, or is it passenger emissions per kilometres travelled? In other words, is this about getting vehicles to be low or no emission, as you're working towards, or can you drive the statistics down by also getting lots of people on the existing diesel buses while we wait to turn them over to being electric? So even the simplest question, is a full diesel bus still better for emissions than the people on those buses all using their cars?
Correct, yes.
And the answer is yes, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's why we're doing both, trying to maximise PT growth, use, and actually decarbonise at the same time. But the more people you can get onto the diesel bus is better than having the equivalent people in petrol vehicles.
Councillor Walker?
A few questions. We had a presentation to us by some council officers around our carbon emissions a week or so ago. And the emissions up to 2019 were tracking up. There were probably 4 data points since then, and I don't doubt that they're tracking up further. I asked a question then, can you provide us some information on those emissions? And I'd ask that question of you just as it goes to transport, so that at least we as council know where our transport emissions are heading. There are some good proxies there, for example, the amount of diesel and fuel consumed. You've got that information for Auckland. Is it possible to update us on that on a far more regular basis than we're getting from another source. And my further question is, if that is the case, and I would anticipate that our emissions have gone up, our prospect of halving our emissions by 2030 is nigh on impossible based on what our existing proposition is. And if that is the case, and we accept that, what can we do to dramatically accelerate the circumstance? And I know there was a mention of electric buses. I think there are 500,000 electric buses in China, for example, and they're not a world leader, but that's what an expert told me a few days ago. Quite obviously, there are other cities that are doing more. So coming back to my question, what's our implementation plan looking like to achieve halving our transport emissions by 2030?
That's a very complicated question, which I think is probably better to work through the TERP action plan that we are working with, and it sounds like you're referring to a presentation last week on that. So I'm sure we can provide more regular reports around that and how that's tracking. Remember, as I understand it, the halving of the emissions for transport is against the 2016 baseline. And so while it's been going up, it's still going to be benchmarked against that point. Now, in terms of how do you accelerate all that, well, again, it comes back to what's the funding appetite and availability. We can decarbonise the electric bus, the bus fleet as quickly as we want. It's basically funding, and it's what's the optimum use of that funding. At the moment, we're taking a view that we want to utilise the diesel assets to effectively, in most cases, end of life, as opposed to simply switching out. There's also, through the TERP piece of work and ERP and everything else, is how do we get the private vehicle fleet accelerated? And that's probably a bigger question than just for Auckland Transport to resolve.
One further very quick question, and it just goes to that. There's a circumstance where EVs are now almost on parity with ICE vehicles in terms of internal combustion cars on price. That circumstance has changed rapidly. So what conversations are you having with companies like Tesla, for example, that could literally lay out a plan to decarbonise Auckland's transport emissions? Are you speaking with them?
I guess it's fair to say we are regularly getting some conversations with the likes of Tesla and other unsolicited proposals, particularly for use in creating charging infrastructure within car parks, for example. And we're also having conversations around, is there anything more you can do in the general road corridor? But of course that creates other hazards and issues, particularly with the way the new unitary plan type on the legislation around use of car parks in dwellings, etc., has been structured.
Okay, I'm happy to move this to have a seconder. Second from Councillor Fletcher then. You want to speak now?
Just very quickly, and I really just want to emphasise that if we look at other cities, if we look what's happening across the US, where fast charging stations are being rolled out across hotel networks widely. You can look at a map of the US and it's populated by any number of charging stations. We need to be doing that in Auckland with some rapidity. We don't have to spend the money on that. We just have to enable it to happen. So I just make that point, Mr. Chair. It's urgent.
Thank you, and thank you, Stacey, Mark, and some good progress there. Next item, 17. I'll put it to the vote. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. Item 17, level crossings program update. Mark.